Hi there, everyone. Welcome to a book review by CAMILLE'S Harem. Not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers. Because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And back when we went to the Tucson Festival of Books, we were looking at all the different kinds of new novels that were coming out and everything, and Scott and I were convinced that we should get the book The Curator by Owen King, the son of Stephen King. And at least what convinced me to get this book was there is a flying morgue ship that is picking up people and it's Lovecraftian. I'm like, whew, sweet. I'm planning on writing a Lovecraftian story in the future. I need some inspiration. This sounds pretty fun. The original pitch actually turned me off to the book, but I was like, you know what? If you've got a flying morgue ship, that sounds awesome. So I'm going to read this book. We got the book. We tried reading it. Only one person in our group, Danielle, was actually able to finish it. Now, I have the reviews from both myself and from Scott. I'm going to let Scott speak for himself first, and then I will give my review for The Curator.
When I first heard about The Curator, it was from the actual author at the Tucson Book Festival. It was the world building, the little tiny bits that attracted me to the book that made me want to purchase it, get it signed, and read through the book. But the parts that I was excited about, mainly like the world building, the fantasy aspect, the cats and all that, there's not as much there as I would like. Is the catch. It's a perfectly great book, but I couldn't find myself even identifying with any of the main characters, let alone even caring about their stories. So that's kind of why I struggled to get through what I did. I think it's very well written. There's a lot of great stuff put into it, and I've actually learned a few good writing lessons that I wouldn't have otherwise reading the book. It definitely makes me want to try to have a bit more of a not so time focused, not so progressionary focus to my stories. I can have scenes from way in the past to like a little bit in the future as they're relevant in the story, and it helps the readers be able to piece stuff together by themselves. I like that idea. But this one, it had a hard time connecting the main plot and the world that they lived in, if anything. And I feel like there's some people that would really enjoy this book. I'm not one of them necessarily. So definitely gonna take the lessons that I've learned, but move on. I don't think I'm gonna be able to finish this one, but it is a fun book, and I've got a cat stamp in it from the author, so I'm happy about that. It's a fun little collector's item, if anything, at this point, to me. Anyway, that's my opinion on this.
Alright, Lars here again. My review for The Curator is this. I don't know what this book wanted to be. There were a few different stories that were prominent within this book, each one of them trying to be something else that the others weren't. The main story with the main character was by far the most boring and the most tedious, and it could have been something really good, but Owen King took way too long to develop it, and that is the character Dora, who is the curator who's out for her own mysterious purposes. There are some neat breadcrumbs laid out at the beginning to let you know what she's kind of after by taking over this museum that has been abandoned in the wake of a citywide revolution. That could have been really, really interesting, but it took way too long, and he spent way too long trying to justify this really awful relationship between her and one of the revolutionaries who has become a police officer in this new regime. It was just way too tedious, and I didn't care about these characters. They were not memorable, they were not enjoyable, and it just took way too long to get to anything that was worth it. And that's never a good thing. When the subplots and the subplot characters are more interesting than the main characters, you've done screwed up. This is where things got even trickier and weirder to read. So, before I even talk about the Lovecraftian stuff, when we then look at the citywide revolution, this right here is actually where I think where Owen King excelled, where people think that George R. R. Martin is a good writer. People like to say George R. R. Martin's books are like this fantastic history book that you can get swept away in it. As a historian and as someone who has also read plenty of historical fiction, I will tell you this, that is not how George R. R. Martin writes. Not at all. He writes dark fantasy in his own way. Owen King, on the other hand, actually wrote a fantastic historical fiction here in The Curator, but there was so little of it. We get kind of this, well, what if there was a Marxist revolution in London? How would this have looked? And it's fantastic. It works so well. You can tell that he did his research to figure out the different kinds of characters, the different kinds of ideologies, what might have tipped the scales to making the people revolt. And then actually what happens when the revolution is over, most people are all like, what did this actually give us? And the regime is trying to live up to some grand ideals that they know that they can never cash in on, and so they have to then resort to witch hunts in order to make Marxism work. This is fantastic. But the problem is that as far as I read, and I only made it a little more than halfway through, there's only small little snippets of this greater history in there with its characters, and so it's not enough to override just how boring the main storyline is. Then when we get to the Lovecraftian stuff, oh, it's so well written. You can tell that this guy's inherited the spooky genes from Stephen King. He knows how to write some good Lovecraftian horror. The morgue ship is brilliantly set up, and how it eventually sails off and then begins to claim its victims on the nights where it claims its victims are all really spooky and good. They're fantastic short stories, but that's what they are. They're only short stories. They only last for about 1,000 to 2,000 words at most, but oh my gosh, it's fantastic. And the way that cats play into this as a religious symbol, or even as maybe deities, it's really, really great. You can tell that there's some weird cosmic horror, some ancient dynamic between the living and the dead that people have long since forgotten, that is remembered by the cats. There's actually a chapter, a very short chapter, but there's a chapter where you get to see the world through the perspective of a cat, and that was phenomenal. It was so well written. But here's the thing, though. All of these are very, very small moments, very small blips in an otherwise very boring story. As a result, I just wasn't hooked. Towards the end of my time reading it, I began speed reading after the halfway point, just trying to find something that would be good. The morgue ship parts and the revolutionary parts at the beginning of the book were really interesting, but then it was just bogged down with the main character and just whatever she was up to, and it was not interesting. And Danielle, who finished the book, said that she had to force herself to finish reading it because she did not want that to be on her conscience, that she had an unread book just lying around in her house. And so she finished it, and she was like, well, the ending is actually really interesting and it's kind of cool, but I don't care about the main characters. All of us were in a position where we just don't care. And while Scott definitely found, I think, some good writing advice, for me, my writing advice would be figure out what kind of story you want to tell. And if you actually want to tell multiple stories within a book, you need to balance it. There was not enough Lovecraftian horror. There was not enough revisional history or history fan fiction going on here. There was not enough of the side characters to balance out how boring the main character was. And that'll probably be my second bit of advice. Figure out how to not make your main character boring! And what I would have done then for the main character, Dora, is that I would have had her making far more progression towards her end goal way sooner. And I probably would have taken out a little bit more of just the fluff and stuff, like all of the really awkward sex scenes. They were not needed in this book at all. There's no reason for them to be there. If you want to have one, sure, throw it on in there. But come on, man. You didn't need this. You're pulling a George R. R. Martin and thinking that you're going to hook people with dispassionate sex? No, that just sucks. Instead, trim down the main storyline, make the main character way more interesting, give her stuff to do far sooner in the story that helps to advance her side of the plot, and then add in more of the Lovecraftian horror. Make the people within this fake London be terrified and really justify the witch hunts that the revolutionaries go on, and show us more of what the revolutionaries are doing to try to make their new regime succeed and how it's ultimately falling apart. That would have been fantastic. You then would have gotten a very rich, wide-screen view of everything that's going on within the city, and then people would be able to more quickly piece together how all of this is supposed to tie into the end with the final battle against the Morgue ship. I think that if Own King had done that, it would have worked out really, really well. And this is something that, again, I've had to learn in my own writing. There have been a couple of books where I just went way too hard into trying to develop the characters. This led to just tons of dialogue that really didn't need to be there, that needed to be trimmed. Character moments that I enjoyed, but honestly didn't advance the plot along. And that is one of the trickiest things to do, figuring out how to weave together plot advancement and character advancement. The two should go hand in hand. It's nice to every now and then be like, okay then, here's the plot, moving forward, the characters are getting pulled along, what's happening? And sometimes it's nice to pump the brakes and focus on the characters. You need to have those moments throughout your story, but overall, character progression and plot progression should be going hand in hand. If you have to pump the brakes every chapter to focus on one character and be like, this is what they're doing in their life, trust me, it's going to be important later on, you're slowing down the story way too much, and maybe you need to reconsider your pacing and what you're all putting into your story. Maybe if the story just focused on Dora, the main character, without anything else, it might have been an interesting character study, but since that wasn't what we got, it made her actually stick out in a bad way in her own story, because everything else was far more entertaining, even though we got so little of it. And that is why I think that The Curator is not worth your time to read. I would not recommend this book. I would, if I could, I would return it and get my money back because it just wasn't worth it. So with all that being said, if you're out there looking for more writing advice, please check out our other videos here on our channel. You can also check out some more of our reviews and analyses. They're really awesome. Check it out. You can also head on over to our podcast, Camille's Harem, where you will have the chance to listen to all of the Harem members talking together, having great conversations with each other. And if you'd like more of that, please let us know down in the comments below, so that way we can try to get the gears moving there again and get that podcast up and running once more to an efficient way. And if you'd like to support us, always like, comment, share, subscribe. That's always great for us to see. But especially check out the books that we ourselves have written and published. It would really, really help us out a lot. But thank you for watching and for listening. And until the next video, y'all, tschüss.